Welcome back, dear students, to another session on criticism. I'll be introducing you to the concept of classicism in this session. Here I present before you the 9th and 10th sessions of Module 2 for students of BA 5th SEM, Paper 1, Criticism, prescribed for Karnataka University, Dharwad. I'm Dr. Vijayalakshmi Naik, Assistant Professor, GFGC and PG Center, Dharwad. The term classicism is very confusing because it carries so many meanings. Despite this confusion, the term is still useful in describing particular styles and impulses in literature and arts. Classicism means clearness, elegance, symmetry, and repose produced by attention to traditional forms. It is sometimes synonymous with excellence or artistic quality of high distinction. More precisely, the term refers to the admiration and imitation of Greek and Roman literature, art, and even architecture. Now, order, maturity, harmony, balance, and moderation are some important qualities of classicism. To define classicism, classicism actually developed so gradually and exhibited so many phases that a perfect definition is not possible. Classicism is based on the idea that nature and human nature could be understood by reason and thought. So it has attached much more importance to reason than to imagination. So more broadly, classicism refers to adherence or to virtues, including formal elegance and correctness, simplicity, dignity, restraint, order, and proportion. In general, classicism can be defined as a style in literature that draws on the styles of ancient Greece and Rome, and it is often very opposed to romanticism.
Okay, dear students, so at the outset, let us understand the difference between classical and classicism. So what then is a classic? A classic is a work of high authority. It could mean a literary work that is acknowledged as excellent, a book or work that is of high standard, and something that has withstood the test of time. That is classic. Okay. Classical is conforming to ancient Greek and Roman models in literature or art. Classical means something that adheres to strict rules, structure, and restraint, something modeled on the Greek and Roman literature. So, what is classicism then? Classicism is a style in literature, art style and theory of art, which is based on the ancient Greek and Roman theory of art. It may be in the visual arts, music, architecture, which adheres to the form and conventions of ancient Greek and Roman concept of art. For example, the symbolist movement employs the Greek myth in creation of symbolist imagery. All right, that is classicism. Now, to distinguish between classicism and classical antiquity, we have to understand that classical antiquity was a period of time between the 8th or 10th century BC and 5th century AD in Rome. The time period between 8th century BC to 5th century AD, that time period in Rome can be called classical antiquity. Now, classicism is what is inspired by classical antiquity, looking back at classical antiquity and trying to emulate and imitate it. That is classicism. Now, the word classicism was coined in the 19th century. It means those qualities which are most characteristic of the best literature of Greece and Rome. It is partially identical with idealism also. Classicism has come to be associated not just with imitation of such ancient art, but also with such qualities as harmony, order, proportion, balance. It is seen as a style equivalent to other historical styles in European art like Gothic and Baroque. It aims to express the inner truth or central principles of things without anxiety for minor details, and it is by nature largely intellectual in quality, though not by any means to the exclusion of emotion. In outward form, therefore, it insists on correct structure, restraint, careful finish, and avoidance of all excesses. For example, we have Paradise Lost and by Milton, Arnold's Shorab and Rustum, Edison's Essays. These are all in the classical spirit. Scholars overwhelmingly acknowledge the debt the Western canon owes to the ancient Greeks and Romans for their contributions not only to Western literature but to Western culture. The works of the classical writers were often admired for their restraint, restricted scope, sense of form, unity of design and aim, clarity, simplicity, and balance. And classicism, as defined in the Oxford Dictionary, is the following of ancient Greek and Roman principles and style in art and architecture, literature. In other words, the term refers generally to a high regard for a classical period, classical antiquity. Classical antiquity, I've already told you, is a period of time between 8th century BC and 5th century AD in Rome. Okay, so that becomes the setting for standards of taste which the classicists seek to emulate or imitate. Now, literary theories launched in the classical age have quite remarkably kept a grip on people's mind. So much so that in the we see this in during the 14th century to 18th century AD, and it can be seen in literature, architecture, art, etc. of these times. We see the first truly international aesthetic point of life in the coming of about 5th century BC in Greece. And Greece was seen as the culture to emulate. Uh, and then eventually Romans started to ascend to power and they borrowed from the Greeks. And then the Romans spread that right around the Mediterranean. And when time passed and Rome fell, the empire fell apart. But the interest uh, in the ancient authoritative art was still intact, which was classicism. So they emulated it and kept it going. And then we see there was a revival for this during the 14th century to 18th century AD, and it can be seen in literature as well as architecture of those times. This was when Pythagoras experimented with music and created music theory. Yes, the same Pythagoras who also gave the famous geometrical theorem, Pythagoras theorem. He was also an innovator in the field of music. And intellectuals of that time were masters in many fields, unlike now where specialization has crept in. Now, drama was a major source of entertainment in ancient Greece, and performances would last for days and were organized around seasonal festivals. We see Homer documented many of the Greek myths and histories in his great epic tales, the Iliad, which is the story of the siege of Troy, and the other masterpiece by Homer is the Odyssey, which is the adventures of the hero Ulysses. Now we also have Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus, some of the great playwrights of that time, what we call the Greek antiquity. Okay. Um, Plato and Aristotle are the important critics from Greek literary criticism. We also have, when we consider the Greco-Roman criticism, we have Horace, Longinus, Aristophanes, and others. Now, if we look at what Plato thinks of poetry, we see that you know he thinks of it in two ways. The first as a way of shaping behavior, and the second as a means of communicating knowledge. Now, initially, he seems to believe that poetry can make a contribution to both, but eventually he concludes that it can neither improve nor enlighten us. The reason lies in poetry's mode of expression, imitation. And as we have seen in the earlier sessions, Plato argues that there is a realm for ideal forms, and then there is our world, which is an imitation of that realm. And finally, there is art, which is an imitation of that imitation. Or to put it in another way, poetry is a poor copy of this world, which itself is a poor copy of a perfect world. So the realm of ideal forms is also the realm of truth, which Plato conceives of in mathematical terms. If this is the thinking of Plato, then Aristotle gives poetry value by putting it on par with philosophy. He rescues mimesis from Plato and makes it central to poetry by rooting it in human nature. It is about what may happen and therefore encourages us to see the world differently. So, poetry is not just a form of imitation, it is also a stimulus to imagine. Aristotle dwells into the origin of literary genres, describing their formal features, comparing their different qualities, and making judgments about their respective merits. He also shows that different kinds of poetry produce different kind of pleasure, an idea that would have horrified Plato. With Aristotle, therefore, we inch away from poetry as ethics towards poetry as aesthetics. All this shows that he has a greater understanding of the properties of poetry than Plato. Then, to name some of the other critics from the Hellenistic age, we have Callimachus, who worked at the Great Library of Alexandria, and then we have Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus, who were concerned with the integrity of the text rather than its ethics. We also have Xenodontus, who is regarded as the father of textual criticism. Now, Aristophanes and Aristarchus did more than merely comment on ancient manuscripts. They were accepted by Romans and Renaissance scholars, and mostly, what they did was they revived Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and they owe their place. Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they owe their place in Western culture due to Aristophanes and Aristarchus. All right, because we see that they seem to believe that the greatest literary works were in the creations of the past. Then again, we have Horace, Longinus from the Roman criticism, the Roman critics, Longinus and Horace. Horace's Ars Poetica, it belongs in the tradition of prescriptive criticism, which is also called legislative criticism, and was established by Aristotle. So Ars Poetica is also uh, in the tradition of prescriptive criticism, uh, which gives the aspiring writer, some rules and conventions to follow. First and foremost, the aspiring writer must aim at nature. This will give his work unity and simplicity. Imagine a painter combining a horse's neck with a human head. That would be, something very comical, right? So this is what Horace talks about in Ars Poetica. You know, it is in Horace that we find one of the most famous of all quotations about poets, that they aim either to do good or to give pleasure, or thirdly, to say things which are both pleasing and serviceable for life. Ars Poetica, its advice on how to write, its view on tradition, and its pithy definition of poets is one of the important texts of antiquity. Okay, this is the most familiar account of Horace's epistle, uh, and it concentrates on his contempt for the crowd, his worry about the effect of money on the nature of poetry, and the significance of his imagery insofar as it relates to coins or the marketplace. It reveals an anxiety about poetry's place in society and an attempt to rescue it from the taint of trade. Now, the other critic, the Roman critic, is Longinus, who is the author of another key work of Roman criticism on sublimity, which was written during the 1st century AD. Uh, and just like Horace, Longinus also was worried about the fate of poetry, wondering if its fallen condition could be blamed on the change from republican to a monarchical system of government. Now, Longinus defines the sublime primarily in terms of oratory, a reminder of the close connection between literature and rhetoric in the classical world. The sublime is a kind of eminence or excellence in discourse and produces ecstasy rather than persuasion in the hearer. Hmm? So, although Longinus states that metaphors which come under diction are conducive to sublimity, he stipulates that they should be used with caution. Now, we see that Longinus argues that the sublime is the highest form of literature. This provides a means for discriminating between different kinds of writing. Those that approach the sublime are to be preferred to those which merely conform to the correct standards of composition. The sublime is the highest literary value because it is the one that most expresses our essence. It is our nature to be elevated and exalted by true sublimity, says Longinus. Okay, criticism, it seems, is based on a conception of human nature as much as it is on what constitutes good literature. Longinus is prepared to praise the achievements of uniformly beautiful writers, but in the end, it is not they who transport us. It is not they who take our breath away with some marvelous stroke. That is the gift of, some great writers like Pindar or Sophocles, who sometimes set the world on fire with their vehemence. So, on sublimity, like Ars Poetica, is written in the form of a letter explaining how to achieve a literary effect, and far from dismissing the idea that poetry should give pleasing percepts, Longinus glorifies it. That is, poetry should give pleasing percepts. The sublime, he writes, adds grandeur to principles of service and utility, something they can never have in the sphere of mundane existence. All right. So, Longinus' account of the sublime challenges the notion that the value of a work can be expressed in numerical terms. It cannot be accounted, you know. If good points were totted up, not judged by their real value, Longinus declares, then we would have to say that Hyperides would in every war surpass Diomanthes, but the former's beauties, though numerous, are without grandeur. The sublime, in other words, counteracts the tendency of criticism to develop as a form of calculation. It is a reminder that something higher than the human is sought in literature. So, on sublimity stipulates that what methods must be used to achieve the sublime suggests that it is a matter of procedure as much as passion. So we see that uh, there were many critics who have given some important ideas about how literature should be written and read. Now, to look at the brief history of the journey of classicism. Classicism is a force which is often present in post-medieval European and European influenced traditions. Some periods felt themselves more connected to the classical ideals than others, particularly the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, and some classicizing movements in modernism. The study of ancient Greek was virtually unknown in Western Europe till the 15th century. Classicism first made an appearance during the Italian Renaissance. It introduced a host of elements in European culture. Petrarch, the father of Italian humanism, first learned about classicism and uh, promoted classical learning. His classicism was most strongly received by Boccaccio. Up to this point, classicism had been mainly a literary pursuit. Outside Italy, writers affected by the revival of classical conventions included Bacon and Johnson in England and Corneille and Racoin in France. Now, the advent of printing is likely responsible for the permanent establishment of classicism as an integral part of Western civilization from the 14th century to the present day. Italians, no doubt, played the lead role in the revival of antiquity in the 14th and 15th centuries. But in the 16th century, that role was assumed by the Northern Europe. Here, classicism particularly flourished among scholars in France, Germany, Switzerland, and, of course, England. Now, to look at the 18th and 19th centuries, in the 18th century, the pursuit of these ideals became codified in terms of rules of decorum deriving from Aristotle's Poetics and Horace's Art of Poetry. The Augustine Age in England stretched from the time of Dryden to the middle of the 18th century and included many self-conscious attempts to imitate the poets of the Augustine Age in in Rome. In German literature, the classicism was revived when Goethe and Schiller wrote classical drama. In 19th century, you know, uh, it continued or extended many classical programs. And in the 20th century, we can see that there was a renewed interest in Greek literature. In the works of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, one can easily find classical ideals. Abstracted classical elements can be found in paintings of some of famous painters like Pablo Picasso and Paul Cézanne. Now, a more overt classicism has found renewed acceptance among many postmodern architects in recent years. In the present day philosophy, classicism is used as a term, particularly in relation to Apollonian over Dionysian impulses in society and art. That is a preference for rationality, or at least rationally guided catharsis over emotionalism. So, in conclusion, we can say that um, classicism has influenced not just literature but all of the arts. It has its effect on the entire world. It is clear that this movement has transformed Western culture in many ways. Some of its major precepts are surviving into the 20th century and still affecting our contemporary period.
So with that, we come to the end of this session on classicism. I hope you all enjoyed the video and I hope it was of use to all of you all. As always, I have some very easy peasy multiple choice questions for you, dear students. Please go through it. And I'll see you in the next session where I'll be dealing with Romanticism. Thank you so much.